Julia asked about what are the implications of this research for teaching children to read, right? And there's a sort of simple answer which I feel confident in, and a more speculative answer which I think we need more research on. The simple answer is, well, first of all, I think the education research on early reading education is very clear. We need something that stresses the mapping between print and words, right? There's no doubt about that. And some of these ideas can help, and we have a whole line of work looking at how different cognitive principles like variation and clustering and so forth can help improve that kind of learning, right? So that's the easy one. But here's the harder answer to your question, Julia, is that I don't think reading really focuses on automaticity and efficiency. And I think that's actually likely to be really important. And I don't think we really know how to teach that. I don't really know how to teach that. I think there's probably some insight to be gained from work on like procedural learning and motor skill learning that could easily be applied to reading, and that's where I would look. I think one of the things that we do know from that work is that you need rapid feedback within 500 to 1,000 milliseconds of your response to get a gain, and it doesn't generalize, it's slow. So to me that says maybe supplementing traditional instruction with a computer-based approach to procedural learning could help. That seems like one way to kind of leverage that model, because of course you still need traditional instruction so kids understand it, but also so they get the bigger picture, right? Reading is not about word recognition, reading is about understanding language, right? And you can't take the teacher out of that. But you might be able to help improve automaticity that way. Now there may be other ways. Leah Zimmerman, who was a graduate student at Iowa until recently, she's now at Augustana, did a cool study on repeated reading, which is a fluency intervention, right? And she had some kids read the same text over and over again, and yeah, they got better. Other kids read 3 different texts that comprised the same words, but in different sentences. So she was harnessing this principle of variation, right? So that they couldn't just memorize the passage, they had to learn how to recognize these words more automatically. And she got slightly bigger gains for that. So, I mean, maybe that's the payoff of how these principles could inform reading instruction, is to think seriously about automaticity. But I think the whole field, and myself included, need to think more about how to achieve that. That's like a new target, right? Rather than just thinking, you know, are kids fluent? What are the 5 pillars? Decoding, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary. We should be thinking, are they fast, right? Are they efficient? Can they fully suppress competitors? And I don't know if we know how to do that. The first question is about the sort of changing context, right, of the children in our longitudinal study. And, you know, we're doing our best to capture that. Unfortunately, we're drawing all of our kids from 2 school districts, right? We were lucky to get 2. I had to build a lab in Cedar Rapids to get the other one. But, you know, we need more studies that, like, draw kids purposely from different cultures and that's a random effect now, right? So our study isn't equipped to really answer that. I mean, we're doing as much as we can in terms of survey work with the parents, and to some extent with the schools, to try to understand what's going on. And to some extent, the fact is the kids are probably all getting treated pretty similarly by these 2 school districts. I know how they deal with struggling readers, and I know how they deal with non-struggling readers. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all shape. Good for our study, bad for generalization, right? So I think this is a big deal, and we need to wrestle with it more. We may need more larger multi-site studies. For the lifespan study, you asked basically the same question, and there we've done our best to match on education level and language skills, which were the 2 we could pull off easily with no grant. In the new grant, we're going to be able to do a lot more matching. And the one I'm most interested in is career status, right? Take a person who's, say, 65, who is or isn't retired, their social network changes dramatically. Their engagement with text is going to change dramatically when they're no longer working, depending on their job, of course. There's a part of me that wants to, like, write a little grant to just look at people right at that cusp on some of these factors. I think it'd be a cool, natural experiment. But we haven't done that yet. So we're going to try to make that a lot richer when it gets to the new aging study that's about to start this summer. Because, you know, and I'm not used to thinking about these sorts of factors as a cognitive scientist. Put people in the lab, it's all inside their brains, let's just measure that, right? And it's clear that's not really sufficient, that we really have to be thinking about the world. So if you have ideas of things I should be looking at, I am very open to them. The idea is that, you know, vocabulary is one of the few cognitive skills that remains stable or grows with age, right? Everything else declines. Vocabulary, people learn new words their whole lives. And so the idea is that people's lexical processing system can't keep up with the demand, essentially. I like that idea. it seems like a really promising one. We are actually measuring vocabulary to the extent we can in the next go-round. That really reminds me of some of Michael Ramskar's work on aging, right, where he sees it as a natural consequence of a system that just keeps learning. And he's got some really simple and interesting cognitive models of that. Yeah, so it seems like maybe the language processing you adapted when you're 45 is perfect for a 40,000 word lexicon, but not for a 50 or 60,000 word lexicon. And that's an interesting idea. I need to think more about how to test that, but that feels right, because again, it doesn't treat cognitive decline as a decline, right? In fact, it's a gain in one thing, but the system just can't kind of balance it the same way. The idea is the lexical quality hypothesis, right? That processing is in part, or maybe entirely, a function of how deep you understand a word. I'm not sure that's the whole story here, though, because we're testing people on words that are already kind of maximally deep, right? We're testing them on common words, not the rare words. And I've been wrestling with this theoretically, and I don't know the answer yet, if you take a lexical quality perspective, which I really think is the first place to start, you're sort of saying, hey, look, processing is irrelevant. It's just all about representation. But is there processing that's independent of the representation? And I don't want to take a strong information processing view that these things are separate, right? They're not. But I think there are aspects that are not representational. So a good example is inhibition. When people hear a word like net, it actively suppresses neck. Now that varies. Kids that are different ages are better at that inhibition than others. Kids that have developmental language disorder do not appear to have that kind of inhibition. So is that part of the quality of the representation of net, or is that something that we want to talk about separately? I don't know yet, right? I think you could argue it both ways. I think it's very difficult to disentangle representation and processing. So I'm not going to attempt to, but I am going to sort of make the rhetorical point that processing needs a little attention here, and that we've been really emphasizing representation since the 60s. Let's swing the pendulum, and then maybe when we understand processing, we can sort of put these ideas back together. What is a listener's goal? I mean, this is new to me too, so I'm thinking out loud here. I'm not coming to you guys with a fully fleshed out theory. We published this applied psycholinguistics paper last week and wrote it last year, so I'm still kind of coming around. And you'll probably see lots of places in this talk where I've violated my own kind of claims, right? Because I'm still in this old world. Here's what I think about goals, right? It's clearest to me in hearing impairment. I mean, some people who lose their hearing and get a cochlear implant, they want to get back to their offices, they want to work, they've got a rich social life. For them, it's really critical that they hear in diverse environments. Speech and noise is a big deal for them. Processing different people's voices is a big deal for them. Other people don't. They want to hear their grandkids on the phone, and if you've got a good Bluetooth connector for your CI, they're happy, right? Their listening goals are different than the first person. And so the way that we want to treat them as audiologists might need to be different, right? And the way that they adapt their language systems might be different. Wait and see might be a great possibility when you're talking mostly to your grandkids who speak slowly, right? But less good when you're trying to keep up in a busy lecture. And so, listening goals make a lot of sense in that context, right? I think the other place where goals make a lot of sense is if we think about the diversity of bilinguals. And I'm not a bilingualism researcher, but my postdoc and friend Ethan Kulu is dragging me into that world, and it's absolutely fascinating, right? And if you look at the language goals of a heritage speaker, someone who maybe spoke a different language than the majority language at home, they don't need to be able to give an academic lecture in it, right? They need to be able to talk about the things that their family values, that they need for their home life. Their goals, being a bilingual, are very different than an immigrant who is now coming and having to give talks in English or function in the business world in English. And we like to say, oh, these heritage speakers, you shouldn't even use that demonstrative. They have impaired in their first language. They're not impaired. They have the language they want and they need. And maybe they're impaired in their second language, or maybe they're not, but that's the wrong model, right? We should think about what people actually want out of language, and it's not all the same. It's not all the same. It may be when we think about basic things like recognizing a visual word, right? In Illinois and Iowa, every kid probably wants or needs to do that, and if they don't want to, we should probably make them anyways because it's good for them. But I think in a lot of circumstances, people do come at language with different desires and goals that are shaped by their own unique experience, whether it's with a different language, with a hearing impairment, whatever, right? And we can respect that. We can also push them. We don't say, well, look, if you want to succeed, you better read here. This is what we do here in DeKalb. We read, right? But what they're going to adapt might differ based on what they perceive their goals to be or what the goals of their immediate community is, meaning their schools, their families, and everything. And so all of this language development, it isn't like inexorably going to one end, right? It's not like language development has to get here. This is a sort of Piagetian view, right? You get to the final stage. It's going to where these goals shape it to go. We may disagree that that's the right outcome, and that's fine, right? As educators, as speech pathologists, as audiologists, we can say, oh, you might think you want this, but look, if we can help you here, you're going to be a lot happier. That's okay, but we need to be honest about that, and we need to assume there's not one normative endpoint here. So that's my early musing about goals. If you have thoughts, I mean, you've done a lot of work that's at a higher level of language, and I think it's probably very relevant to this discussion, but that's where I'm at the moment after maybe a year of thinking about this. The problem, and many of you live in this world, is we can use labels research-wise and kind of tell ourselves labels are dumb, right? No, it's continuous, right? In the real world, labels matter because they get you reimbursed for services, or they get you eligible for a 504 plan or an IEP plan, right? I'm not actually sure how Illinois handles it either, but it's something similar, I'm sure. So the labels matter, I think, and this is the risk of subdividing our thing into these separate fields, is that then the labels rear back, right? Oh, the labels become a thing. Now we got to explain this cause, even though originally the label was just a convenient tag and something that's necessary for societal goals of making sure children are being treated and helped that need it or want it, right? And so, I think that we need to be very careful about labels. I mean, I think it is important for us as a culture to have them. I don't see how else you get people Medicaid services for mental health therapy if you can't diagnose somebody with something, right? And of course, the RDoC framework is moving towards more continuous models for that, which is good. But I think as researchers, we need to acknowledge that that's kind of a farce, that the majority of speech and language deficits are just you're not performing relative to your peers, and we don't know why. Like DLD is that way, dyslexia is that way, motor apraxia is that way, speech motor disorders are that way, mild cognitive impairment is that, right? It's just you're lower than your peers in your normative sample, whatever that is. And I think as researchers, we need to start there. I've been actually shocked too in hearing impairment. I never knew a lot about hearing impairment until I came to Iowa. And I was from Rochester, which had a big deaf community. And there, deaf is categorical. You're deaf or you're not, right? You wear a single cochlear implant or you don't. But oh my gosh, the diversity we see of hearing impaired people with fully deaf one ear and perfectly normal hearing on the other ear, partial hearing in both ears, and they lost their hearing in their sixth. Well, are they prelingual or postlingual? I don't know, right? It's an enormous amount of variation. And rather than just saying, hey, this is a cochlear implant user, we need to explore it. It means our research is a lot more expensive, right? We need to sample widely and really embrace that. But I think labels are dangerous for the science, to be perfectly honest, but absolutely necessary for getting people help and services that they need. And I don't know how we navigate that tension. I think that's a healthy tension, but we need to keep that tension on and not just get sucked into the simplicity of labels, but sort of work at that edge. That's easy for me. I'm a cognitive scientist. I don't have a clinical bone in my body. I'm not certified to help anybody. I don't have to fill out any of that paperwork. So it's very easy for me to say that from the 60,000-foot perspective. For the people in the trenches that are bridging research and clinic, and I think those are really, really important things to be doing, it's a lot harder to stay at that sort of very unstable middle ground. And so I understand that, and I don't want to be too preachy because I come from a somewhat privileged position of being able to just focus on it as a research problem.